Welcome again to those that have joined us today for this fourth session of the 2019 AgrAbility Virtual National Training Workshop. My name is Paul Jones. I'm the manager of the National AgrAbility Project. For those of you who may not know me or have attended previous webinars in this series, this afternoon's webinar is an introduction to vocational rehabilitation services. And our presenter is Steve Etheridge. Steve was a longtime Indiana Vocational Rehabilitation Services counselor. He is still active with us at the National AgrAbility Project and with the Indiana AgrAbility Project as a consultant. So we very much appreciate his efforts and his willing to be with us today. Some of you may not be familiar with AgrAbility. We are a program sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We focus on issues of disability in agriculture. Every AgrAbility project is a partnership between a land-grant university and at least one nonprofit disability services organization. There are currently 20 state projects around the country. There's one national AgrAbility project that's here at Purdue University through the Breaking New Ground Resource Center. And our partners on that grant include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, APRIL, the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, Colorado State University, and Washington State University. If you'd like more information about AgrAbility, feel free to browse agrability.org. There's a lot of information there, many resources, including over 70 other archived webinars if you would like to look at those. At this point, I'm going to turn off my camera, mute my microphone, turn things over to Steve Etheridge. He'll give the body of the presentation, and then I will return during the question and answer period.
Good afternoon, and we'll consider this a brief sound check. And
we can hear you.
Okay, great. So it is entitled What to Expect when Working with Vocational Rehabilitation, and I guess in retrospect I consider that kind of an odd title because who knows what to expect. But the purpose of vocational rehabilitation is to empower individuals with disability, particularly individuals with significant disability, to achieve high-quality employment outcomes to which they aspire and that are consistent with their unique strengths, resources, priorities, concerns, abilities, capabilities, and informed choice. And this is part of the Rehabilitation Act, and you'll find it in the 34 CFR 361.5, which are the written policies governing the provisions of services for individuals with disability. I identify the sources of in this case, of the written policy and others, so that should you have questions, you're able to look that up fairly quickly online and find that whole document, and be able then to relate or gather information related to questions or concerns that you may have. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was amended through Public Law 11495 that was enacted in December of 2015. We'll talk a little more about some of the changes that occurred with that most recent amendment, because the Rehabilitation Act was, I'll use the term, folded into the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, and we'll discuss that toward the end of this presentation. We'll discuss some of the implications of that most recent amendment. But any state that submits a state plan to the Secretary is eligible to be funded. 78.7% of the dollars are federal, with a 21.3% state match. So it is a state-federal program. Vocational rehabilitation is available in all 50 states, plus Washington, D.C., and territories. I think there are 56 maybe vocational rehabilitation programs throughout the combination of the United States and territories. Vocational rehabilitation's mission is to serve people with disability in obtaining and retaining employment that's commensurate with their abilities, interests, and limitations. The mission is to meet the individual rehabilitation needs of each person, and then to manage the financial resources to provide services that are both necessary and reasonable. So in order to meet the needs of the individual, the rehabilitation needs are identified by the completion of a comprehensive assessment. And the comprehensive assessment would include such things as identifying the vocational implications of the disability, identifying need for assistive technology, home or vehicle modification, maybe a seating and positioning evaluation, identifying level of intellectual function or psychological well-being, vocational interests, and other things. Those are just a few examples. Managing the financial resources that are necessary and reasonable. Necessary relates to the employment goal and/or the functional limitations or vocational impediments of the disability. All services provided by vocational rehabilitation must address one or both of either the employment goal or the vocational impediments. Reasonable relates to the cost. For example, if due to the vocational impediment or functional limitation is in regard to mobility, a hard floor surface may be necessary to traverse in a wheelchair. However, solid oak flooring, while providing the necessary surface, may not be reasonable when compared to tile flooring, reasonable in cost. However, if the consumer chooses the solid oak flooring, they would simply pay the difference in material and installation costs over a tile flooring or a less expensive option. Vocational rehabilitation must also consider comparable benefits such as insurance, education scholarships, grants. In all the years that I worked for vocational rehabilitation, I can think of no instance where a consumer incurred a cost that they did not know about up front before the cost was incurred, provided that they communicated with vocational rehabilitation and received prior approval or authorization. And typically, or at least typically from my experience, comparable benefit did not include in-kind cash or cash on hand from the consumer. I want to mention AgrAbility's mission statement. The vision of AgrAbility is to enable a lifestyle of high quality for farmers, ranchers, and other agricultural workers with disabilities so that they may succeed in rural America. Success includes gainful employment in production, agriculture-related occupations, access to appropriate assistive technology, and evidence-based information related to the treatment and rehabilitation of disabling conditions. And the reason I want to point this out is to note how closely the AgrAbility mission statement aligns with the purpose of vocational rehabilitation that was outlined in slide 7, I think, and the first part of the vocational rehabilitation mission statement. And I guess I encourage you, or I think it's important that vocational rehabilitation recognize how well aligned AgrAbility is to its own mission to encourage and hopefully enhance collaboration. The AgrAbility vocational rehabilitation relationship is important because farming is inherently hazardous due to accidents, physical wear and tear, and then aging all contribute to functional limitations or vocational impediments. And in vocational rehabilitation, we had a saying, I guess maybe among ourselves, that if we lived long enough, we would all have functional limitations, or we would all have disability. Research indicates that there is a risk of depression or secondary disabling condition that increases with delays of returning to work. And that is not only in regard to farming, but across the board. However, I think it is specific to farming, or a real potential, I guess, in regard to farming. And real recovery occurs when a person is able to return to their chosen profession. Evidence indicates among farmers with disability that they have a strong desire to return to farming, and a refusal to be constrained by disability. Vocational rehabilitation is a viable funding source for many, if not all, services, again, related to the functional limitations or vocational impediments of the disability, and then the employment goal. As we consider vocational rehabilitation employment hierarchy, same job, same employer would be the top or the gold standard, and then it goes from there: different job, same employer; same job, different employer; different job, different employer. I want to point that out because same job, same employer would be what a farmer with disability, that would be what, or your AgrAbility clients, that would be their experience. Farmers have a higher successful rehabilitation rate than the general population, and when I gathered this information some time ago, there was a nationally 98% success rate for vocational rehabilitation of AgrAbility consumers. And in regard to Indiana, for example, and I don't have the time period noted here, but 77 farmers with disability were served, and only 3 were not currently farming. 2 had retired and 1 had passed away. So that's kind of an indication of our support of the success of AgrAbility and vocational rehabilitation, a level of success that should be emphasized to vocational rehabilitation. And actually, however, this is one of, or this seems to be, I should say, one of the areas of concern by vocational rehabilitation, and we'll touch on that at the end, or toward the end of the presentation. Talk a little bit about eligibility for vocational rehabilitation services. A person must have a physical or mental impairment that for that individual constitutes or results in a substantial impediment to employment, or a substantial barrier, either preventing them from getting and keeping a job, or doing the work, doing the job that they have been doing. Must require vocational rehabilitations, require services, and then would benefit from the services to successfully obtain and retain employment. And then order of selection is another consideration in regard to eligibility for those states that are under an order of selection, and that's a majority of the states by a big amount. But the most significant disability must have 3 areas of functional limitation, and it's 3 out of 7. And the 7 areas are communication, interpersonal skills, mobility, self-care, self-direction, work skills, or work tolerance. So here's an example. of actually a neighboring farmer, a farmer that lives about 1.5 miles from me. And because I'm his neighbor, I did not manage his case file with vocational rehabilitation. But he was injured when a loaded gravity wagon became unblocked and rolled over him. His farm is a combination livestock, beef, and sheep, and then crop rotation of alfalfa, corn, soybeans, and wheat. And he experienced multiple fracture of the forearm and hip, dislocation of the shoulder, probably torn rotator cuff. And he lost upper body strength, including grip strength, loss of range of motion, could no longer stand or walk for prolonged periods of time, and could no longer walk safely over uneven surfaces. So the resulting vocational impediments were that he could no longer lift and carry full 5-gallon buckets to feed lambs. He could no longer lift and carry bales of hay out to the cattle, could no longer walk safely across tilled fields to scout crops or check fence, could no longer safely sort and load livestock for shipment. He could no longer do that safely and independently, and he could no longer reach up to pull himself up to the first step of the combine or tractor. And so following an assessment by AgrAbility, some of the services recommended and provided were lowered steps on the tractor and combine, an ATV to assist with mobility, a corral with swing gate and chute, and then independent of either vocational rehabilitation or AgrAbility, the farmer then upgraded his bale handling system and went to big bales and using forks on the loader or on the front of the tractor to handle the bales. But each of the recommendations addressed the vocational impediments that resulted from the disability, and then allowed the farmer to benefit by being able to continue farming. I should mention in regard to order of selection at the bottom that there are 3 categories. One is no significant disability, and that would have either 0 or 1 area of functional limitation. Significant disability, which would be 2 areas of functional limitation, and then most significant disability, which would have 3 or more areas of functional limitation. And typically, when a state is under order of selection, they are serving only those who have the most significant disability, are in the most significant disability category. Comprehensive assessment begins after the individual has been determined eligible for vocational rehabilitation services, and the purpose is to assess the unique strengths, resources, priorities, concerns, abilities, capabilities, interests, and informed choice of the eligible vocational rehabilitation individual. It determines the goals and objectives. It determines the nature and scope of vocational rehabilitation services. And then the comprehensive assessment, the information gathered from that, is used to develop the individualized plan for employment. As previously mentioned, the goal of the comprehensive assessment is to identify the rehabilitation needs to address either or both the employment goal and the vocational impediments. In regard to the individual plan for employment, or IPE, the mandatory components are a description of a specific employment outcome, a specific description of specific rehabilitation services, a timeline for the initiation of services and the achieving of the employment outcome, a description of the vendors that are chosen to provide services, a description of criteria to evaluate progress toward the employment goal, and then terms and conditions or joint responsibilities of the individualized plan for employment. So the again, the specific employment outcome is to be commensurate with the consumer's unique strengths and resources, abilities, and the other items listed. Informed choice is important, and so the consumer has input into the individualized plan for employment. In simple terms, I think of the vocational rehabilitation rule is to make sure the consumer has all the information they need to make decisions that are correct for them, and then to make sure that whatever they agree to have happen in regard to services, for example, to make sure that does happen and that it's within established policy and procedure. So the specific employment outcome, to be able to return to work, to retain the employment that you've had. In the case of a farmer, that would be the specific employment outcome, to retain employment in production agriculture. The rehabilitation services would be related to the comprehensive assessment, and a piece of that comprehensive assessment, most likely, or at least from my experience, would have included an evaluation by AgrAbility. And in Indiana, we had a purchase service agreement with Breaking New Ground, and so I was able to authorize for that farm visit and evaluation by Breaking New Ground staff. The timeline, the purpose of the timeline is a way to evaluate progress and kind of keep track of things. This description of vendors, that can be, sometimes that's part of the evaluation that would identify, if the recommendation, for example, in the example I presented, the ATV, a vendor was identified as, a dealer, actually, where that could be purchased. And then joint responsibilities, the consumer's responsibilities, or in this case, the farmer's responsibility, and vocational rehabilitation. And I always considered and explained it to the people I worked with in this way, that I considered the individualized plan for employment to be somewhat like a contract, to be an agreement. These are your responsibilities, these are the things that you'll need to do, and these are the things that I need to do to achieve the outcome, with everything pointing to the employment goal. So this little graphic, the assessment, comprehensive assessment, drives the individualized plan for employment, and then the individualized plan for employment drives the services that are provided. So if there is a service that is necessary, but it's not on the plan, the individualized plan for employment, the IPE, can be amended to include the service. Again, that would be an agreement between the farmer with disability or the AgrAbility client and vocational rehabilitation. And the amendment process it's not a difficult process. And whatever service would be added to the plan, again, that service would need to be necessary and reasonable. It would have to address either the functional limitations or vocational impediments of the disability, or it would have to address the employment goal. And again, I want to emphasize that the AgrAbility client or the farmer with disability has lots of input into this process. And I also, I guess, want to emphasize how important this process is in providing the services that are necessary. Because if the service is not on the plan, the service won't be provided. And I might have just repeated myself. I might have said that earlier. So always the goal for vocational rehabilitation is employment. And so we're looking for a successful employment outcome at vocational rehabilitation closure. Again, the employment outcome must be consistent with the person's interests, abilities, and limitations. It may include self-employment or telecommuting or business ownership. It must be in an integrated environment, not in an isolated environment or a sheltered workshop, or not an enclave work situation. Of course, none of those would relate to AgrAbility. It must be at or above minimum wage, federal minimum wage, and or state minimum wage if it's higher. And it must be a minimum of 90 days following the completion of rehabilitation services before the case file is successfully closed. And essentially, what this successful employment outcome, essentially what that is, it's the definition of competitive integrated employment. Again, it may be full-time or part-time, and we'll discuss a little bit about competitive integrated employment here toward the end of the presentation. I want to mention the Client Assistance Program. It's a part of the Rehabilitation Act. Here I identify the number of 56, so there's one Client Assistance Program in each state, territory, and Washington, D.C. It's to assist any client with programs covered by the Rehabilitation Act, primarily vocational rehabilitation and independent living. The client must initiate the appeal process. In other words, as AgrAbility staff, you cannot initiate the process on behalf of the client. The Client Assistance Program appeal process must be initiated by the farmer with disability. The intent of this is to lessen the feeling of intimidation and to restore the relationship between the client and vocational rehabilitation. And it's to make sure as well, I believe, to make sure that vocational rehabilitation has followed policy correctly and has had due process in considering the vocational impediments and the employment outcome and the services necessary on behalf of the consumer, or in this case, the farmer with disability. The eligibility determination and services on the individualized plan for employment are the most common VR components that are appealed. So here's, in regard to Indiana, the Client Assistance Program the person is titled an advocacy specialist. They'll listen to the client, they'll review with the client the questions and concerns of the appeal. If the appeal is determined to have merit, the CAP advocacy specialist will gather information and documentation, including related policy, that will aid in representing the client in the appeal process. The CAP advocacy specialist will support the client throughout the appeal process, and the client does not have to stand up to or to take on, and I put those things in quote, the bureaucratic authority alone. And many times, as you can imagine, a client may feel intimidated by the whole process. They may not want to challenge a decision, fearing they may lose access to other needed services and that sort of thing. But that reprisal should not be part of the process at all. So, and it's fully within the client's rights to request or to consult with the client assistance program without repercussion. In regard to AgrAbility in the client assistance program, the client must take the lead. AgrAbility staff may advocate for the client with the client's permission in consultation with CAP. AgrAbility recommendations, is just a reminder, must address the functional limitations as related to the employment goal and must be necessary and reasonable. And if the consumer permits or the client permits, AgrAbility staff may serve as an expert witness in regard to the employment goal, in regard to the accommodations and/or assistive technology in an administrative hearing. In other words, how are those recommendations? If your recommendations are what's in question, how are those recommendations going to make a difference to allow that person to continue farming? So, this last slide, I'm going to call attention to some recent AgrAbility or state and regional AgrAbility program experiences with vocational rehabilitation. And I guess I want to touch on two different instances. Maybe I'll do the second one first because it's the easiest. The bottom bullet point: review of assistive technology over $5,000 has to be reviewed at the federal level by RSA. And this is a fairly recent decision, and I think I've learned of, well, it takes effect nationally, so every state is affected by this. And in a recent telephone call with Paul Jones and with the CSAVR, which is Council of State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation, they were taken by surprise on this decision through RSA. And so one of the changes in the most recent amendment, by placing the Rehabilitation Act under the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act. So one of the changes is nearly all of the programs under the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, with the exception of vocational rehabilitation, all of those are under the Cabinet Secretary for Department of Labor. Vocational rehabilitation remains under Department of Education. And so one of the changes that's occurred is the change in performance accountability requirements. And basically, what vocational rehabilitation, what I would have had to do to successfully close a case file for performance purposes has changed. And what Department of Labor requires is essentially what they're looking for is, first of all, in regard to, well, there's a change in reporting. First of all, there's reporting in terms of wage and placement or wage and employment, not only at closure, but also the second quarter following closure, and then the fourth quarter following closure. So that's one change, that performance standards or performance accountability requirements extend out for essentially a year, where in the past under DOE performance standards, it was essentially at case file closure. So one of the things that's critical And a bit of a challenge in regard to farming is, of course, wage at closure, wage at placement. And the required method of documenting that is through, by the WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, is to use the unemployment insurance wage records. Well, folks that are self-employed or business owners don't report to that. So one of the challenges in regard to farming is being able to report the wage at closure. And so the second bullet point is a training and employment guidance letter, WIOA number 26-16. And I identify that for you because that is the that is the way that vocational rehabilitation can document wages of people who are employed but do not report those wages into the unemployment insurance wage record. It's called supplemental wage information, and so that's a document that you can look up and print off simply by putting that into the into your search engine. And in the document, it explains relatively clearly ways that a VR counselor can document wages, including self-report, follow-up surveys, self-reported from program participants, can include, income earned from commission and sales and other positions, detailed case notes verified by the employer and signed by the counselor. And of course, if a person's self-employed, that's verified by them, that are appropriate to the program. And one thing that I'll just mention that's noted in this document, at the bottom of page 7, is that it states not all self-employed individuals receive a salary, but funds that represent income over expenses that are available to be invested back into the business can be considered as earnings. So, another challenge that state program has experienced is one in which that state vocational rehabilitation required that the farmer provide 3 consecutive years of information showing a profit, of documentation of a profit. And that was appealed through CAP. And my understanding is CAP's response was that, these are my words, that this is over the top and unnecessary. There's nothing that prevents the state from making that kind of a requirement. And of course, in the way commodity prices are and some of the other things, that becomes, a genuine challenge to document profit before you're receiving services. So without getting too far afield, I guess I'll stop at this point. And Paul, I'll return the webinar back to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. We appreciate your expertise on this. We will entertain questions. I have collected some already, but please feel free to continue to enter those into the chat option. While you're doing that, I'd like to go ahead. First question, Steve, are you able to see that?
I am, yes. What? Okay, I guess the my suggestion is to become fully aware of the 7 areas of functional limitation that are considered for order of selection. That's communication, interpersonal relationships, mobility, self-care, self-direction, work tolerance, and work skills. So, be fully familiar with those and the definition to make sure that that none are overlooked by vocational rehabilitation, or to make sure that the individual has made sure vocational rehabilitation has all the information in regard to the functional limitations. Because I don't know specifically in regard to Washington, but most likely they're requiring that the person be most significantly disabled or to have 3 of the 7 functional areas of functional limitation. The other thing that I forgot to mention that may have an impact on some of the states is that one of the changes in vocational rehabilitation coming under the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act is that WIOA has a pretty big emphasis on serving youth. And if I have understood correctly, nationally, vocational rehabilitation programs has had to channel a larger percentage of their available funding towards serving youth to meet those requirements and expectations. And those are probably, I guess, other than the suggestion I made, I don't have anything additional off the top of my head.
And Steve, those types of decisions about order of selection can be challenged through the CAP program, is that correct?
Yeah, it can be challenged through that. However, I would start with a VR counselor, and make sure they didn't overlook an area of functional limitation. And they should, if a person's on the waiting list, a vocational rehabilitation should have provided them with a letter identifying, how that decision was made. If they don't, that information is available to them. Explain to me, how you arrived at this.
And just to clarify, order of selection doesn't mean they're not eligible for services. It just means there's not enough resources to serve them at that time.
Yeah, it means that they're on a waiting list.
Okay.
Which is not a short list, most likely.
Next question.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the term small business development program, so I might not. That'll be one I'll have to look into. In Indiana, with vocational rehabilitation, we did assist people in developing small business development plans. There's a policy in Indiana, from my experience, the policy that outlines the steps that would need to be taken to consider, providing resources in the development of a small business. And that is one of the areas where we would contract with or authorize for Breaking New Ground to provide consultation on development of a small business plan. And I forget probably the resource amounts available. In Indiana, the client would have had to provide at least 25% of the equity, 25% of have equity in whatever they were requesting related to the business. And then VR had funding available to help make up that difference based on the plan. And so I can't speak for each state, but self-employment has always been a part of the Rehabilitation Act, or always within my 25 years or so of working with, being involved with vocational rehabilitation. And there's emphasis in the Rehabilitation Act for consideration of self-employment, that is a viable option for people with disability. So hopefully it's not disregarded out of hand.
All right. As we're going through, if you do have other questions, I will check the chat area before we quit. It may not make it up on the screen, but I will read it off if you have more questions as we go.
In regard to vocational rehabilitation policies between states, probably I won't be able to give you any specific examples because I've only read different state policies, parts of different state policies specific to questions I've had. But what I can say is the Rehabilitation Act and then Rehabilitation Services Administration allows for a lot of flexibility for states to establish their own policies and procedures.
Okay.
So the chances are there would be quite a bit of variance between states, and I'm forgetting the phrase, but there's one thing that must be included in regard to each policy, that they be able to consider exemptions, and that's not exactly the right phrase, I don't think, or what's used in the Rehab Act, but be able to consider exemptions to that policy, provided that if the policy is preventing a service that is both reasonable and necessary. But that's one of the things that you as advocates for your clients would need to be fully aware of, and that's probably one of the things that wouldn't be volunteered. The information wouldn't likely be volunteered in regard to that.
Okay.
I'll answer this question generally, and for a person, well, the answer is yes. But whether it's farming or some other type of business, that has to be the primary source of income for that individual.
Okay.
I can't answer the question in regard to AgrAbility, whether they have a consent of release of confidential information form, but vocational rehabilitation would have that. And I currently work for a community mental health. I work as needed for a community mental health program, and they have a consent for release of confidential information forms that occasionally I need to use as well.
So I would comment that I know of nothing. I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I wondered if you might know, does AgrAbility have a consent for release of confidential information form that they use?
I'm not aware of any form like that. Some of the states may have their own, but at the national level and in Indiana, I'm not aware of any specific form like that. Okay, so I think there were a couple more questions in the chat. Oh, and this question I think was probably addressed: how much variation of the code application happens between states? I think did you address that as fully as you can?
Yeah, again, the Rehabilitation Act, or the RSA, allows for quite a bit of flexibility to each state in developing their own policies and procedures.
Okay. All right. I see no more questions at this point. So, Steve, again, thank you for your participation, for sharing today, and for everyone that joined us. We are recording this, and we'll be archiving it. We hope you will consider coming again tomorrow for our 2 sessions. And we wish you a good day and a warm day wherever you are. Thank you.